Good morning, everybody. I hope you are well. We're going to make a start, given it's 11 o'clock. My name's Laura. I'm part of the HESA training team, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar today. So I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome to the first of our Graduate Outcomes Statistical Release webinars. We're delighted with the take-up of these webinars. Many of you were in contact to express interest in it, how much these were filling up quite quickly. And these have been put on as part of our support package to users of the newly released experimental statistics from the new survey. So we should have around 95 delegates with us today, which is brilliant. Now I've got a bit of housekeeping that I will run with you first. You will note that you are all on mute. As I said, there are 95 of you, so that's kind of to keep things running smoothly today. But if you do run into any technical difficulties, perhaps your audio is not quite working correctly, you've got some sort of issue, hopefully you will have noticed that you've got like a questions and chat pane on your webinar dashboard. So please do use that to let us know if you have any issues. If that fails and you're not able to use that, as we've sort of seen already, you do have a hand raising icon that you can use. So if the questions and chat pane fails, please use that and we will do our best to message you and try to get you sorted. As I said, these have been really popular, and unfortunately some people weren't able to join just because they were so popular and they were all fully booked rather quickly. So this session is being recorded today, and we will be releasing a recording which we're hoping will be available at the end of the week. We will be having a short question and answer session at the end of this webinar, but obviously with around 95 delegates today, we've got to manage this in a way that allows us to answer as many questions as possible. So rather than unmuting you, we will be making use of that questions pane. So please do feel encouraged to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we will be looking at as many of those as we possibly can at the end. Obviously, with 95 of you, we're not going to be able to get through all of those questions. So we will be taking a look at the questions from all three of the series of webinars after they've all finished, and we will be trying our best to answer some of those in the coming days and weeks and disseminating those answers to you when we've done that. So I'm going to introduce to you the speakers that we have on today. So first I'll start with Neha. Neha and her team manage the operational side of the survey, and she will be providing us with an overview of the survey, its structure, methodology and the development from Delhi. Then Rebecca and Jonathan, part of our official statistics function, they produce the statistical outputs. So between them, they will introduce the statistical releases and the key points to note about them. And then we'll go onto the HESA website for a live tour of that bulletin and its findings. And then lastly, we will finish up with our Q&A. So with that, I am going to pass over first to Jonathan.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Obviously, we're very pleased and excited to be launching the first release of statistics from the new Graduate Outcomes Survey today. It's been a long process, and I think it perhaps is worth just starting the webinar really pausing for a moment to reflect on the journey we've been on with the Graduate Outcomes Survey. It's tempting to say really that this represents the culmination of a very extensive program of work that commenced way back in 2015 in what seems like a different world then compared to now, with the review of the previous destination of Lever's survey, or more commonly known as Delhi. But probably culmination isn't quite the right word, because this suggests that the journey is complete, when of course it certainly isn't. We'll be working very hard to continue to improve and enhance the survey itself and the releases derived from it for many years to come. So I guess really it's more of a major milestone today. I would, however, like us to perhaps briefly recognise for a moment the wide variety of people in many organisations who have worked so closely with us to get us to this point. Really from the colleagues who sat on the original Delhi review groups, to those on the current steering group, to those colleagues in the many providers who have worked so hard to provide us with the necessary information to operate the survey, and who have engaged with us to ensure that the survey quality and the information quality is as good as it can be. Then of course we must also recognise the many graduates who gave up their time to actually complete the survey. On behalf of HESA, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to all of these people. And I know that very many of them will continue to work with us as we develop the survey over the coming years. And of course, I must also acknowledge the strange world we find ourselves releasing these statistics into, with so many obviously suffering grief and hardship from the current pandemic, and with financial worries impacting on the HE sector like so many others. We're probably fortunate in that really the main impacts on us, really, apart from learning to work remotely, as many organisations have over the past weeks and months, is around some impacts on production and release schedules. It is worth, however, I think, stressing that the survey in which we're reporting today does predate the pandemic and is unaffected by it. Of course, future editions of the statistics will be affected by the pandemic and the likely lingering economic after effects of that. We will do our best to monitor these impacts and to explain them as far as possible to our users. But we do believe it is important that the survey continues in full, so that as a society, we really can understand the experiences of graduates as they enter the labour market over the coming years. But that's probably enough in the way of pausing for reflection for now. We've got a great deal to get through in the webinar. So a little later, HESA's colleagues, as Laura said, will provide you with an overview of the survey itself and the first statistical bulletin to be published from it. I thought perhaps what I would do in the next slide really is to provide a bit of something like a quick start guide really, which really tries to address the key points, what you really need to know about the Graduate Outcomes Survey. And yes, spoiler alert, I'm going to be introducing a few things which my colleagues will say a bit more about later on in the webinar. The first point really is that these are experimental statistics. Now this relates to the releases themselves rather than the source survey data, but it reflects that the statistics are newly developed, they are derived from a brand new survey, and that they are undergoing evaluation. We are publishing them at this stage with the aim of engaging with our users to help us to assess the suitability and quality. It doesn't mean or imply that the source survey data is of poor quality or that the data are unfit for operational purposes, but we are advising users to make their own assessments of quality in respect of any given intended purpose. Secondly, it's a survey of graduates. Well, that may seem obvious, but it does have implications, and to be honest, I'm not sure they are always taken fully on board by sector commentators. When we set out about undertaking the fundamental review of Delhi back in 2015, our strategic steering group really set the expectations very firmly that we wanted to put the graduate experience, graduate perceptions, the graduate voice at the forefront of our survey design, and that's what we believe we have done. This means we ask questions of graduates such as what was your most important activity, how they feel about the activities, as well as their subjective well-being. We've undertaken some comparisons of the resulting data with other key data sources to gain an understanding of the characteristics of the survey information. But fundamentally, Graduate Outcomes isn't an administrative data set. And I think if you do really need administrative data, there are other sources that may be more suitable for you, such as the longitudinal education outcomes data set based on tax and benefit records. As a survey, it is also subject, of course, to a response rate, and that response rate isn't 100%. I don't know of any major voluntary survey that does achieve that level of response, unless anyone can tell me otherwise. The overall response rate achieved for this first year of the Graduate Outcomes Survey for, say, UK domicile full-time graduates, for example, was about 52%, which did fall a little below our target, and we are working on strategies to improve that over coming years. It's also below the achieved response rate for the Delhi survey, but we always expected it to be. We were never going to match the response rates at 6 months compared to a survey that has moved to 15 months after graduating. But please don't fall into the trap of thinking that a lower response rate automatically means lower quality or biased data. That is not necessarily true. We have examined the data very thoroughly to assess the extent of bias and whether we need to weight any statistics, and we published that analysis in full. What we found was that the achieved sample of responses actually aligns well in most ways with the characteristics of the population at sector level, and we've therefore decided that we will not apply weighting for this year's releases. This alignment between the achieved sample and the sector population is not a happy accident, but actually is the result of survey design, which kind of takes us on to the issue of quality, really. I mean, as I mentioned, the survey is not an administrative data set, and we don't aim for 100% accuracy on every data item for every graduate. That would be prohibitively expensive, recognizing the survey is primarily funded by our sector providers, and would exceed the quality requirements of the regulators and funders on whose behalf we collect the survey data. And it would also probably be realistically impossible. Our aim is fitness for purpose, which takes me back to what I said earlier about experimental statistics, providing a mechanism for engaging with users to understand their quality expectations and to calibrate our quality enhancement efforts. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we are suggesting that users should really assess the quality of the data in light of their own needs, their own definition of fitness for purpose. And we have published very extensive quality reports today to assist them in doing that. We're also encouraging users to contact HESA if they need some advice and assistance with that. We've worked hard to ensure that the first iteration of the survey delivers data of the right quality to support publication and a range of known uses, and colleagues and providers have worked hard to help us with that. Right now, our assessment is that this data is absolutely fit for publication as experimental statistics. And indeed, if we thought otherwise, we would not be publishing. My final point is probably one that you're getting bored of hearing if you've been keeping up to date with the various blogs and documents about the survey that we've been publishing on the website. And yes, we do keep banging on about it, and we probably won't stop anytime soon. So I'm going to say it again. Please don't compare the graduate outcomes data with Delhi data. The surveys are fundamentally different in a number of key ways that my colleague Neha will say more about in a moment. HESA will not be publishing or undertaking any such comparisons, and we strongly advise users to follow this advice. Okay, I think that's probably enough of me talking, and I look forward to discussing your questions later in the webinar. But for now, I'll hand over to Neha, who's going to tell you more about the survey.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan and Laura introduced me earlier, I will be talking to you about the survey itself, and provide you with a brief overview of graduate outcomes, how it was set up, how we collect and process the data. So on this slide, you're seeing the 4 key building blocks of the survey, as I call them, and that essentially describe how the survey is set up. So as most of you would know, this is an annual survey. It runs from December to November of the following year. So we are currently publishing statistics from the first year, and we are also in parallel collecting data for the second year. So the same data will be published this time next year. The survey, again, as most of you would know, collects data from graduates 15 months after they have completed their higher education qualification. We have a cohort structure, I'll come to that in a second, and that enables us to consistently and broadly measure outcomes at the 15-month point for all graduates, considering some of them will be finishing their courses at different points in the year. The survey is run centrally by HESA and our survey partners, and what this means is that we are centrally responsible for the design, implementation of the survey and the production of the outputs. This work is obviously overseen by a steering group, which is made up of key stakeholders, such as our statutory customers, which comprise regulatory and funding bodies, higher education providers, and other sector bodies. On the next slide, you'll see a brief description of some of the key features of graduate outcomes. I won't go into too much detail. I appreciate a lot of you have seen these slides before and seen the material I'm going to present. So just a very quick recap of what graduate outcomes is. So starting with the coverage, all 4 UK nations are in scope of this survey. It includes higher education institutions and further education colleges. So all in all, we have got over 400 providers, and we aim to survey over 700,000 graduates every year. So it is a large survey. The list of eligible graduates is compiled using student records that are maintained by HESA and other sector bodies. We ask providers to supply us contact details for each of those graduates on that list. Like I said briefly earlier, the survey data collection process itself is split into 4 cohorts. Each cohort lasts 3 months, and that, like I said, enables us to make sure that we manage that 15-month point broadly for all graduates at all providers. Most of our data, which is 70% of the data, is collected in the last cohort, which we call cohort D, but that essentially is the period covering September to November. The questionnaire that we use in the survey, it comprises standard questions on graduate activities, their employment, self-employment, further study status. We then go on to collect information on their details of employment, their job titles, job duties, employer names, course qualifications and provider names, and so on. We also have a separate set of questions on previous activities. So instead of just measuring what they're doing now, we do recognize the fact that people may have been doing other activities in the form of employment or further study in the interim, which is that 15-month period. We then have a separate focus on graduate reflection and well-being. Finally, we have a set of questions that are optional to providers. It depends on their requirements for knowing a bit more about their graduates. So, for example, we have an optional bank on research students, on those who have undertaken teacher training, and that, like I said, shines a spotlight on specific areas that providers may be interested in. Data are collected through two different modes, online and telephone. In order to allow people to complete the survey online, we send them email and SMS invitations and reminders. So this is based on the contact details that providers send us. Our telephone data collection is conducted by a contact center. That's our key survey supplier, and they employed hundreds of interviewers to take part in this exercise throughout the collection cycle. The collected responses from the two modes are centrally collected and compiled by a central survey software system. They are then sent over to our coding partner for industry and occupation coding, which would be most familiar to most of you as SIG and SOC coding. They undertake all the coding, and the coded data is then sent back to HESA so we can process it and compile it into the final data sets. So before we produce the final data sets, we have to do some data cleansing. We derive additional data from the raw data because the raw data are just responses to the survey questions, and we know a lot about our user requirements. And in order to meet those user requirements most appropriately, we convert the raw data into more useful data sets. These data sets are supplied to all our higher education providers and statutory customers, and are ultimately released in the form of an extensive suite of statistical outputs, the first installment of which has just been published. More information on all this that I've just covered in the first two slides has been published in the form of a methodology statement, a dissemination policy, and a quality report that has just been published today. So please feel free to go away and read upon all this. So my next and final slide will just reflect on graduate outcomes and Delhi. And as Jonathan mentioned, this is one area that does come up in lots of conversations, our dialogue with the sector. And I think I just want to stress on the point that the two surveys are very different. And I want to give three reasons as to why they are so different and what does this mean for users of these statistics. So first and foremost, and kind of obvious as well, especially for those who are familiar with the Delhi survey, that the reference point is very different. So Delhi, as you would know, captured destination data 6 months after individuals left their higher education course. Graduate Outcomes does it at the 15-month point. Now, to put it very simply, one cannot assume that an individual will be doing the same thing at the 6-month point and at the 15-month point. So the destinations that we are looking at the 15-month point would not necessarily be the same as the 6 months. So that clearly creates a strong reason why you shouldn't be comparing the two. In terms of the data collection methodology, Delhi data was previously collected and coded by different providers, and sometimes using different methodologies as well. Graduate outcomes data, as I've said, is collected and centrally managed by HESA. We are therefore able to use one single methodology consistently across all providers and all graduates. And last but not the least, the new questions that we have added to the survey. So for the first time, we are able to get new insights into non-traditional destinations, such as people building artistic portfolios or working in freelancing occupations. We also have new questions on graduates' experience of higher education in light of their current activities, well-being, and a few other questions. These differences make it impossible to compare the two surveys and draw meaningful conclusions. And I think that is where the biggest risk lies, that if you start comparing apples and pears, then the result will not be very insightful and you won't be able to draw any meaningful conclusions from that. So our strong advice is to try not to compare the two surveys. Look at graduate outcomes in its own right. It's the first year of this survey, and while we cannot provide a time series because this is the first year, it does offer a great opportunity to look into graduate outcomes from a new perspective. This is a new data set, and it provides invaluable insights into the activities and experiences of graduates. At this point, I think I'll hand over to Rebecca, who will take you on a live tour of the statistical bulletin.
Fantastic, thank you, Neha. Good morning, everybody. Whilst I just share my screen with this statistical bulletin, I'm just going to take you through what's available within the Graduate Outcomes Statistical Bulletin that we published at 9:30 this morning, and cover some of the key findings within the data as we go. So you should be able to see that on my screen now. Before I begin, I should just firstly mention a technology issue that we've had with the release this morning, whereby one or two of the larger tables are not loading for a lot of people. We are aware of this issue, and my colleagues are working to resolve this as soon as possible. The version I have open at the moment and that I'm going to take you through seems to be unaffected by this issue so far, so we'll keep our fingers crossed that that stays to be the case, and we can talk about some of the key findings and what the release contains. So firstly, on what's available within the release today, so we cover national level data from the survey. We include results from all graduates who fully or partially completed the survey. And Nay has already touched a little bit on coverage, but just a reminder that we include graduates from all UK publicly funded higher education institutions and from privately funded alternative providers. In addition, the data include results from higher education graduates who attended further education colleges within England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Okay, so onto the release itself. We begin with a summary section containing the key headline results within the data. The first chart is looking at the outcomes of graduates who responded to the survey by the activity they were undertaking in the census week. And one of the key trends we can see from this data set, from this particular chart, is that 90% of graduate respondents to the survey stated that they were in employment, unpaid work or further study. The second chart we have within this summary looks at average median salaries of full-time first degree graduates who entered full-time paid employment within the UK. And from this chart, we can see that a gender pay gap does exist among full-time first degree graduates who are in full-time paid employment within the UK. This pay gap was largest amongst those in the highly skilled employment group. What do we mean by these skill groups used in this chart? High skilled, medium skilled and low skilled? Well, we have an expandable box just below the chart to explain that a little bit further. But in summary, this is essentially an aggregation of the standard occupational classification codes that describe the type of occupation the graduate was in. A second point to note about this chart, it contains salary data, and within the releases that we're publishing, this release that we've published today, we have cleaned the salary data. So additional analysis we did on the salary results showed that there were outliers in the data. More information on this is available in our dissemination policy and data definitions. But essentially, because we are reporting on graduates in full-time work, we have excluded anyone who reported a salary below the UK national minimum wage equivalent. And we also excluded outliers at the top end, the top 1.5% of salaries. Moving on, we then go into a little bit about the data release, and this just basically covers some important information about the coverage of the data that I mentioned at the start of my talk, and it gives a bit of an overview as to where you can find related supporting materials. It then talks about response rates and gives a bit of an overview as to the response rates we achieved by domicile, and also there's a filter, so these charts are interactive for those of you who are familiar with our releases, and you will be able to filter by mode of the study of the course. A little So for a little bit of information about partial responses and what the difference between complete and partial responses are, it again is available in these expandable boxes. Moving on to the next tabs of the bulletin, these are all arranged by theme. So we have graduate activities and characteristics first of all. This tab looks at, as I suppose the title suggests, more breakdowns by graduate activity by different personal characteristics. So first of all, we start off with a bit of text about the data and what figure 4 shows. Figure 4 I know is the one that a few of you have had trouble loading. This is showing on my screen at the moment. So we're showing here graduate outcomes by activity and domicile. We allow users to choose between different radio buttons to display the number of respondents in each activity, what this equates as a percentage. And we also introduce here for the first time this concept of confidence intervals. So Jonathan mentioned earlier in the talk that we haven't got 100% response rate to the survey. So whilst these percentages displaying on the screen at the moment show the percentage of respondents in each activity category, what we don't know and what we can't be sure of is that if all graduates had responded to the survey, that we would see these exact same percentages amongst the whole population. So the 95% confidence intervals essentially give an indication that we can be fairly confident, in fact 95% confident, that the true percentage value would fall between a particular range. At this point, we also include some more filters to allow you to delve further into the data and investigate the data by particular filters. So we have interim study as a filter, which again is a new concept for our releases. There's an expandable box above figure 4 to explain more about this, what this means. But again, in summary, this is to either include or exclude graduates who reported to have been in full-time study in the period between completing their course and the census week. So if, again, depending on your uses of the data, you may decide that you want to exclude those graduates from the chart. One of the key trends or one of the key points that we pick out in the text above figure 4 is by HE provider, and we can see from the text that 59% of those who qualified from higher education providers went into full-time employment, compared with 48% from further education colleges. And at that point, I should just clarify that so this is from the provider type filter. So within the higher education providers option, we include all the publicly funded UK providers and the privately funded alternative providers. The further education colleges include those higher education graduates who graduated from further education colleges in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Okay, so moving on, we have a couple more breakdowns, a couple more tables breaking down graduate activity by different variables. So figure 5 breaks down the data by personal characteristics. We have data split by sex, age group, disability and ethnicity. This table is defaulting to show those with UK domicile, just because that's the population of graduates from which we have ethnicity data. But you can, of course, select the filter to include non-UK graduates as well, if that's what you would like to do with your analysis. Again, we provide percentage and confidence interval breakdowns for this table, and many different filters. Depending on your needs, you can look at particular subpopulations. Figure 6, again, activity data broken down by participation characteristics. So we allow for state score marker, socioeconomic classification, parental education and polar data. And then we move on to some more detail about graduates who are in work. So first of all, we focus on graduates who stated that they were working for an employer in the UK, either in paid work for an employer or voluntary work for an employer. And we look at the employment basis on which they were employed. At this point, this is the first time that we introduce a work type marker filter. Again, we have an expandable box to explain exactly what this means. But in summary, it allows, so based on what the graduates determine to be their most important activity, it allows you to subset the data to particular most important activities. Figure 8 then goes into a little bit more detail about those graduates who said that they were running their own business, were self-employed and freelancing, or developing a portfolio within their survey. And this is the first point that we introduce what we call a work population marker. So again, we recognise that different data users are going to have different needs, and we're trying to meet as many of those needs as possible by providing a filter to allow the base population on which this table is based upon can be adjusted. So you can either select, again, depending on your needs, any graduates who stated that they were in an activity of running their own business, self-employment, or developing a portfolio. Or if you want to focus on just those graduates who stated that one of these activities was their most important activity, you can filter on that population. Okay, that's the end of the graduate activities and characteristics tab. So the next tab is activities by previous study characteristics, and we start off by delving a little further into activities of first degree graduates by their class of first degree. And this is a nice chart that again just summarises the percentage of those first degree graduates in each activity with a filter by the classification of the first degree of their course that they took. Some key trends coming out from this chart. So we can see from this chart that first degree graduates in full-time employment, the proportion of those graduates was highest among those who achieved first class honours at 58%, compared with those who achieved third class honours and passes at 53%. When excluding those graduates who said that they were in significant interim study, so bearing in mind particularly first degree students, some graduates may have gone on to do a full-time master's course in the interim period and just not long have finished that at the point of the census week. You can exclude those from this chart, and when we do that, we see that 2% of first degree graduates who achieved a first class honours degree were unemployed. And for third class honours, this was 7%. We then move on to show some tables by subject area of the original course. So firstly, another breakdown by the activity the graduate was involved in at the time of the census week, and we have subject data by confidence intervals here as well. And we then start to present some of the data by the standard and industrial classification in figure 11 and standard occupational classification in figure 12. So figure 12, the standard occupational classification, this is where I say we aggregate the first three SOC groups into a sort of total high skilled employment, the middle three SOC groups into a medium skilled employment, and the lower three SOC groups into a low skilled employment. One of the key trends we can see from this figure 12 was that among graduates in UK work, for those who studied science subjects, 82% are in highly skilled occupations. In comparison, for those who studied non-science subjects, 71% were in high skilled occupations. Okay, so then moving on to the next tab, we have some information, a little bit more information on graduate salaries. We start off with a chart by salary band, and from this chart we can see that there is a difference between males and females, as we saw in the summary of the release. We can see that a higher proportion of females are in salary bands earning below £27,000 in comparison with males. The most common salary band in which we see the highest proportion of respondents is this £24,000 to £26,999 salary band. And again, as with other tables and charts, we allow you to filter the population based on your particular requirements to either include all graduates who state that paid employment is one of their activities, or to focus on just those in paid employment where it was their most important activity. On this chart, we also allow radio buttons to display the data by different personal characteristics. And then figure 14 gives a little bit more information on the average median salaries of UK domiciled full-time first degree graduates who entered full-time paid employment in the UK by their subject area. The final tab of I suppose the main data within this release looks at the graduate reflection, or I suppose they're also known as graduate voice questions from the survey. So graduates were asked 3 questions in the survey to summarise their feelings about the activities at the time of the survey. And as one might expect, the answers to these graduate reflection questions did vary depending on the activities in which they were doing. The 3 questions are whether their current activity is meaningful to the graduate, whether the current activity fits with their future plans, and whether the graduate is utilising what they learnt during their studies in their current activity. So figure 16 shows the difference in responses we received by activity. And from this chart, we can see that those in full-time further study were most likely to either agree or strongly agree to all 3 of the graduate reflection questions. And then, so those in unemployment were most likely to strongly disagree or disagree with the question that they were utilising what they learnt during their studies and their current activity. That's the end of the main data within the release. There is a notes section at the end which covers, I suppose, a few sort of frequently asked questions, a bit more about what is included within the release. So do have a read of that when you can. But that's the end of my tour. I'd like to end my tour by highlighting once again that these are experimental statistics. We would like to engage with users of the data on the content of the release, and we welcome all feedback. So you can either feedback to us via the right-hand answering this question on the right-hand panel of the web pages, or getting in touch with the contact details within the release. For now, that's it from me, and I'm going to hand back over to my colleague Laura for the Q&A session.
Brilliant, thank you, Rebecca. Okay, bear with us while I just share my screen. Okay, so we're going to make a start on the questions. If you haven't submitted a question already and you would like to, please continue to submit questions throughout this question and answer session. As I said, we will try to get through as many as we can, but we will make a start now. So for our first question, and Rebecca, sorry, because you've only just been talking, but this is directed at you. Can you clarify, please, which type of graduates this data relates to? So is this all of the students in the survey or a subset, and are these based on UK full-time undergraduate or all graduates?
Great, okay, thank you, Laura. So in general, in the release, we include all graduates who either fully completed or partially completed the survey. But of course, many of the tables and charts within the release will be subset to particular populations, and that should be clear from the titles on each table or chart. There are also footnotes available in some tables or charts by clicking the about figure 9 or about figure 10 underneath the table itself, where more information can be found. So some of the tables will restrict, so for example, the standard industrial classification and standard occupational classification tables, of course, are restricted to graduates who are in work within the UK, but it should be clear from the titles. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
No, it looks like we will move on to the next question then. Rebecca, since you're on a roll, I will direct another one to you. Will there be detailed definitions of what is included in each figure or table? For example, what fields have been used and what filters are applied?
Okay, so the filters are labelled in a consistent way across the tables and charts. So, so they will be consistent where we talk about things like mode of form of study or level of qualification that applies to the course that the graduate undertook in which they were answering the survey about the course that they had graduated from, if that makes sense. So can you repeat the question again, please, Laura?
Yeah, of course. Oh, sorry, where's it gone? Will there be detailed definitions of what is included in each figure and or table? For example, what fields have been used and what filters are applied?
Thank you. So definitions, that's what slipped from my mind. So we have published definitions this morning as well alongside the release, and those are linked to from the release itself. So those are available on our webpage as well to kind of explain some of the key concepts. And additionally, we've got these expandable question boxes where we have filters that we've sort of introduced for the first time in this release that explain a little bit more about what's included in those particular filters.
Just to add to that as well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the range, breadth and depth of material that we published about graduate outcomes probably surpasses any previous release of data from HESA. You know, we've really tried to be as open and transparent as possible around every aspect of this survey and how we presented these statistics. And as Rebecca said, you know, there's a wide range of in-depth material around definitional aspects of the data. But if users do feel that there's further information that you would like to have and you need, please get in touch with us and we'll look at how best we can meet those needs.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question as well, Rebecca, for you as well. Is employment data based on MIMPACT or X activity, and does unemployed include the unemployed and categories, or are these excluded?
Oh, you said that too fast. I caught the MIMPACT and X activity for employment. Can you repeat that again, please?
Yeah, sorry. Is employment data based on MIMPACT or X activity, and does unemployed include the unemployed and categories, or are these excluded?
Okay, so the employment tables, so I'm just thinking through some of the employment tables that we have within the release. Most of them should have a work population marker that either allow you to filter the population based on all graduates who reported an activity of work, so that will be based on the all act fields, or to restrict and just subset to those who reported the most important activity of work, so based on the MIMPACT fields. Some of the tables earlier in the release, so thinking of things like figure 4, 5, 6, those are looking at graduate activities based on the X activity field. So where we have activity in the table itself, that is generally based on X activity. Moving on to unemployment, so we recognise that different users are going to have different needs and have different definitions about what they want to include when they talk about things like unemployment. So you'll notice that some of the tables within the release split out people who say that they are unemployed but due to start study from those who are unemployed and say that they are due to start work from those who just state that they are unemployed. And we've tried to keep those separate wherever possible so that again, different users of the data, depending on their needs, can decide what they want to include based on the analysis that they need to produce.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, and then, oh, this is a short question. How is interim study identified?
Interim study, so again, in our definitions, it fully explains exactly all the details about how we work out if somebody was in interim study or not. But essentially, it's any graduate who, between the point of graduating and taking the census survey week, if they completed a full-time course with a higher particular type of qualification, we include all the higher education qualifications and professional qualifications, then we include them in that group. So we allow you to, on particular tables, exclude that subset of people from the data if relevant, again, for your particular needs. And we provide an example in the expandable question box on one of the pages of the release, we have a question that says, what is interim study? And we provide an example of where you might like to exclude those types of graduates. But again, it will depend on what exactly you're trying to do with the data.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is for Jonathan. What can we expect from each of the next 2 open data releases, so next week and in early July? Also, how will data for competitor analysis be presented for providers to use and analyse?
Sure. Well, I think the key difference in terms of the next 2 open data releases will, of course, be that those will address provider level data. So they will include tabulations which are broken down by individual providers. In general terms, apart from that, it will just be more detail, more in-depth analyses than we've been able to include within the bulletin. So it's in general sort of tackling the same sorts of topics, but in more detail with a greater number of cross tabulations possible. So that's really what we're trying to do with the next 2 releases of open data. In terms of the competitor analysis, so I think probably the main vehicle for delivering data for competitor analysis is going to be the HESA system, which most of the sector, I think, use quite actively. That, of course, is delivered by our delivery partner, JISC, these days. We are in discussions with JISC about defining the set of appropriate graduate outcomes data to be released through the HESA service. And I know JISC are also looking at building some new dashboards around graduate outcomes data that will support competitor analysis for providers. So that work is underway. In an ideal world, we would be ready to launch that pretty quickly after we've published the bulletin, but unfortunately this has been a complex process. There's been a lot to deal with in terms of actually preparing the main releases, so we've not been able to put quite as much effort into that as we would have liked. So I can't yet give you a date when we can expect that material to start emerging in HESA. That's work we're really looking to focus on over the coming couple of weeks in particular.
Brilliant, thank you. Does anybody have anything they wanted to add to that, or should we move on to the next question? Okay, cool, we'll move on. So Neha, this question is for you. It's quite a long one. Our survey population includes part-time courses that are not degrees, and this group are not graduates. Could they be excluded from future survey populations? They often ask why they've been sent the survey and don't understand why their activities need to be included in our graduate statistics.
Thanks, Laura. So if I've understood it correctly, I think this is referring to part-time courses that are not degrees. So in terms of the courses that are in scope of graduate outcomes, it is not just degree courses. So there may be HNC or HND type courses that are not degree courses. They could be level 4, level 5 courses, and they're also in scope. I suppose there's obviously a broader discussion around people who go from a level 5 to a level 6, and they may get surveyed twice, which is the current setup. So once you finish level 5, if you move to a different provider and finish your level 6, then you will be in the survey population twice. We are reviewing that at the moment. But in terms of the scope, non-degree higher education courses are also in scope of the survey. There's a fuller detail of the types of courses that are in scope or out of scope on our website under the coverage statement.
Brilliant, thank you. Rebecca, another question for you. For subjects, what classification scheme are you using? JACS, HECOS, or something else?
Thanks, Laura. So so we're using the JACS classification for the subject data within this release. We're providing data at subject area level within this release.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, another question for you. Do you think the data is robust enough to be used to inform the teaching excellence framework? And, if so, why or why not?
Well, that's a good question, but I don't think it's one that I'm well placed to answer. I think that will be a decision for particularly the Office for Students and the other administrations in the UK who feed into that discussion. So unfortunately, I don't think that's one that I can really answer. And any answer I put to that would be quite speculative. I think people like the UFS will need to make the assessments of quality and decide whether they feel that the data are fit for that particular purpose.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, another one for you. I'm not quite sure why we would want to exclude or include those with interim further study. Surely we'd want to look at those who did interim further study with those who didn't. Unless I'm missing something, we can only get to this by deducting the exclude count from the total count.
Okay, so again, it will depend on the uses of the data to which the user is wanting to run. The example we have within the release for why you might want to exclude interim study is, for example, assessing the rates of unemployment of graduates. So we know that there are some first degree graduates who go on to complete a full-time master's course, for example, in the interim period, and then just come out of that at the point at which the census survey week begins. So they won't have had half as much time to be looking for work compared with their peers who have come out of study at the point of their first course. So it may be that when you're looking at unemployment, you may deem it more suitable to exclude those who reported to be in significant interim study.
Great, thank you. And then another one for you, Rebecca. Is the work as an activity filter derived from X activity or ALACT?
Work is an activity is derived from ALACT.
Great, thank you. Oh, bear with me a moment.
Again, I just sorry, I was just going to say, I'll just mention that, yeah, if anyone has any questions about the filters and it's not clear in the release, do get in touch. You know, we're more than happy to help, you know, if you are trying to replicate some of these figures, but hopefully it's clear from the titles of the tables and the filters themselves and the definitions that we provide alongside, but do get in touch if you want some help with that.
And just to add on that one, so that filter exists on quite a few of the figures in the release, which allows users to select between whether work has been defined by the graduates as their most important activity, or whether it is simply one of the range of activities they have reported. Yeah, so that you have the ability to make that distinction when using the data.
Great, thank you both. Rebecca, another one for you. We will be asked to match our institution data to the data you have provided today. So it's key that we know exactly which filters have been used. Or I think this might have been a point, but have you got anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so just similar point really. If anything isn't clear, please do get in touch and we're more than happy to help you work out exactly which fields are used within particular filters. But as I said, all the supporting information is there, so please do have a read of the definitions of these expandable question boxes, of the footnotes to the tables, and all the other documentation that we provide. The answer may well be in there, but please do feel free to get in touch with us and we'd be more than happy to help you work that out.
Thank you. Neha, this next one is for you, and I'm sure this is on a lot of people's minds. Going forward, will the Graduate Outcomes Survey for 2019 graduates take into consideration those who have been made redundant due to COVID-19?
So the questions, as I mentioned in the methodology bit of the presentation, they refer to the census week. So all graduates who are surveyed in a particular cohort are asked to reflect on their activities in the census week. So if in the census week they were in employment, then they would be encouraged to record that activity. If they were not in employment, then accordingly they would record that. A slightly related question is around furlough, which comes up quite frequently nowadays. And we have made allowances for recording anybody who has been furloughed as a result of the COVID-19 situation, but enables them to still record their activity as employment if that is relevant.
And just to add as well, I think this is a question that's probably equally, if not more concerned with how we present the resulting statistics than the survey itself. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we are acutely aware that the pandemic and the after effects of that are going to have a significant impact on graduate experiences as they enter the labour market, and we will be looking to ensure that we explain that as fully as possible to our users. But we firmly believe that we need good data and statistics about graduate experiences during this period. We need to understand what the impacts on graduates are. So we have no plans to scale back the survey or to change the coverage. We want to try and ensure we have complete and reliable information to really help us to understand that impact.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, this next question is for you. Have you had any requests from league table compilers for graduate outcomes data yet?
So discussions have commenced. What we are doing is we are meeting with as many of the key league table producers as possible to really ensure that they fully understand the data, what it's capable of providing, and that we are trying to understand what their expectations are and what they're trying to achieve in use of the data. So we are having direct and constructive conversations with them about that, and we want to try and ensure that we're not in a situation where anyone is going to misrepresent data because they don't fully understand it. So we're at pains to try and ensure that they do really understand the data that's being published and is available.
Great, thank you. I am aware of the time, everybody. I think we're going to squeeze in a few more questions. Rebecca, this next one is for you. Can you say more about how we best group the 12 X activity groups into smaller groups to identify like activity? Is voluntary or unpaid work best grouped with employment?
Okay, so I think, again, this is really going to depend on what you're trying to use the data for. And I suspect that different data users will have different needs. And depending on what that need is, you may want to group up particular categories within that X activity breakdown. So, for example, you may want to group up voluntary work with paid employment, if that is something that's important to your particular use. For some people, you may want to exclude it. So we've really left those categories individually so that we give the users the choice as to how they group up the data. We don't want to force this upon anybody.
Great, thank you. And then when provider level information is released next week, will subjective wellbeing be presented at provider level?
We're not planning on producing subjective wellbeing data by provider level, no.
Another question for you. Have you derived interim study from other HESA returns, or is it self-reported? For example, might overseas interim study be captured, or only interim study in a UK higher education provider's HESA return?
Okay, so at the moment this is derived from the Graduate Outcomes Survey itself. There's a section within the survey that asks graduates what they were doing in the interim period. One of the sets of questions is about particularly study in that interim period, and we've derived it from those specific results. Now, in the future, and again, a lot of our supporting material talks about this in the future, we would like to try and start linking data sets to see if we can find students in our own student records, but that's not something that we've been able to do for this particular release, partly because of timings of the surveys compared with when the student data is available.
Great, thank you. And then another question, in fact, another two questions for you. Which tables will be available at provider level?
I don't know if I can give out the details of which specific tables we'll be producing by provider next week, but just to say that we are looking at producing some provider level tables, and those will be published next week. And as soon as they're available, please do have a look and give us comments.
I guess this follows actually. Will the open data releases replicate all today's figures for each higher education provider, so I don't have to try to replicate?
So no, I can confirm that we're not planning on producing a higher education provider table for every single of these figures that we have produced within this release today. As I said, we're more than happy to help if you do need to try and replicate figures for a particular provider. We're more than happy to help you do that and explain further exactly what restrictions we've put on different subsets of the data.
And just really to add to that, so as the first releases and as experimental statistics, we're trying really to get a balance of a specification of data for both the bulletin and the subsequent open data releases, which delivers on the majority of users' requirements, recognizing that in a very complex data set, you know, there are huge numbers of permutations of how you might combine data to create different tabulations and charts. Part of the process of releasing these as experimental stats is so that we can, you know, release this first specification of data, assess the kind of feedback we get, and evolve and improve that over time so that we are meeting more of the needs. So if there are things in both the bulletin and the open data that aren't meeting your needs, just let us know. Please let us know, and we will work to try and improve that over time.
Great, thank you. And then the last question, I'm aware that it's 12 o'clock, everybody. We should only be going on for another couple of minutes. Rebecca, somebody's commented that it's interesting that 40% of unemployed students agreed or strongly agreed that they were using their learning in their current activities. Is there any indication from their responses what they might have been doing that presumably wasn't captured in the X activity options?
Oh, so this must be from the graduate reflection questions. So I might need to repeat that, Laura, but I think you're saying that 40% of graduates who were unemployed at the time of the survey said that they disagreed with, which question was it?
Bear with me, let me just
sorry.
I think that was so yes, so I think if I understand the question correctly, I mean, this is not a figure that I've looked at specifically, but you're saying that a high proportion of those in the unemployment category also at the same time agree that they are using their course in their current activity, and that may be attributable to the fact that, of course, within the survey we ask for most important activity, and we also ask for the full range of other activities which are being undertaken. So it could be that these graduates have selected unemployment as their most important activity, but they're also undertaking other activities where they feel they are using their skills. I mean, it seems a bit contradictory, but I think it's something that certainly we could look at, and over the next few weeks and months, I'm sure there'll be many other interesting characteristics of the data that we're going to want to look at and try and investigate further.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that does answer that one. That brings us to the end of our question and answer session, everybody. Please be rest assured, as I said, that we will be taking away questions and reviewing some of the remaining questions that we weren't able to answer today in conjunction with the others from the other webinars in this series, and then we will hope to disseminate answers to those in the coming days and weeks. So just to finish, we've got plenty of information and resources available to you in addition to the detail included in the bulletin itself. So it's all there to support you and to contextualize the releases. So all of this, including the examples shown, is available on the link on screen. And then lastly, what's next? So as you may have seen in our communications, production work on the open data release continues to be affected by technological constraints and the ongoing challenges of remote working, which I'm sure everybody is feeling, caused by the pandemic. Therefore, the release of the open data will be divided into two tranches. So this has been mentioned briefly already. The first will be published on the existing announced date of the 23rd of June, and then with a second aimed for Thursday, the 9th of July. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. Apologies for running slightly over, but hopefully you found the webinar useful. And otherwise, thank you very much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.